The rain had been falling on Whitchurch for 3 days when Eleanor Hartley buried her husband, and it did not stop for the funeral. It came down gray and patient over the churchyard of St. Aldwyn's, soaking the shoulders of the 12 people who had bothered to attend, dripping from the brim of the vicar's hat as he spoke words that Eleanor could no longer hear over the sound of her own careful breathing. 12 people. She counted them without meaning to. Thomas had known hundreds, or she had always believed he had. The man who left the house before 6 each morning and returned after dark, who spoke of colleagues and contracts and long drives to Birmingham and Leeds, who apologized for missing supper with the tired smile of a man giving everything he had to keep them afloat. That man, she had assumed, had a world full of people, and here at the end of it stood 12, most of them neighbors who had come for her sake rather than his. She wore the black coat she had owned for 9 years, the one with the fraying cuff she had turned under and stitched so it wouldn't show. Beside her, her daughter Prue held an umbrella at the wrong angle, letting the rain fall on them both, too numb at 16 to notice. He was a private man, the vicar said afterward, pressing Eleanor's cold hand between his. But a good one, I'm sure. Yes, Eleanor said, because it was the only word available to her. She did not tell him that she wasn't sure at all. That in the 4 days since Thomas Hartley had collapsed on the kitchen floor with a sound she would hear for the rest of her life, she had begun to understand how little she knew about the man she had slept beside for 19 years. The first strange thing came the following Tuesday. Eleanor had spent the morning at the kitchen table with the bills, which was where she spent most of her mornings now. Thomas had always handled the money. It had been one of those quiet arrangements that form in a marriage without anyone deciding on them. He brought it in, he managed it, and she never asked, because asking would have suggested she didn't trust him, and because there had always, somehow, been just enough. Just enough, that was the phrase that had defined their life. Just enough for the mortgage on the narrow terraced house on Cobbler's Row. Just enough for Prue's school shoes and the boiler repair and the modest Christmases. Never a holiday abroad, never a new car, never the extravagances the Hartleys watched other families enjoy. Thomas would shake his head at such things. We're careful people, Nell, he'd say. Careful people sleep well. So when the letter arrived from a solicitor's office in London, Ashworth, Finch and Crane, the letterhead heavy and cream-colored and expensive feeling under her fingers, Eleanor assumed it was a mistake. Some debt, perhaps, some final indignity. Her hands shook as she opened it, already bracing. Dear Mrs. Hartley, it read, We write regarding the estate of your late husband, Mr. Thomas Edward Hartley. It is a matter of some urgency and considerable importance that you contact our offices at your earliest convenience. We would strongly advise that you attend in person and that you bring identification. There are matters pertaining to the estate that cannot be adequately addressed by correspondence. It was signed by a Mr. Julian Crane, senior partner. Eleanor read it 4 times. Then she set it down on the table between the electricity bill and the council tax reminder, and she looked at it as though it might change if she stared long enough. Estate, Thomas didn't have an estate. Thomas had a life insurance policy of £11,000, which the man from the insurance company had already explained would take some weeks to process, and a house with more mortgage on it than value in it, and a 14-year-old Vauxhall with a dent in the rear door. There was no estate. There was only her and Prue and the frightening arithmetic of a widow's future. She almost didn't go. The train to London was £38 she couldn't spare, and the whole thing smelled of the sort of trouble that arrives dressed as good news. But there was a second phrase in the letter that she kept returning to, turning it over like a stone in her pocket. Considerable importance. And beneath the fear, so faint she was ashamed of it, something else had begun to stir. Not hope exactly. Hope was too much, but the edge of a question. Who were you, Thomas? The offices of Ashworth, Finch and Crane occupied 4 floors of a Georgian building off Lincoln's Inn Fields, the kind of address that announced money before a word was spoken. Eleanor stood on the pavement in her 9-year-old coat and felt every eye that wasn't looking at her. A young man in a suit that cost more than her monthly income held the door. Julian Crane was perhaps 60, silver-haired, with the unhurried courtesy of a man who had delivered difficult news many times and had learned to do it gently. He rose when she entered, came around the desk to shake her hand, and guided her to a chair with a hand at her elbow as though she were fragile. Perhaps she looked it. "Mrs. Hartley," he said, "thank you for coming. I know the journey wasn't nothing." He returned to his side of the desk and folded his hands. "I want to begin by saying how sorry I am. I knew your husband. Not well, few people did, but I knew him for the better part of 20 years and I respected him enormously." Eleanor's mouth was dry. "You knew Thomas?" "I did." Something in her tone made him pause. "Mrs. Hartley, may I ask, how much did your husband tell you about his affairs?" And there it was, the question beneath all the other questions. "He worked in logistics," she said slowly. "Supply chain consulting. He drove to the Midlands mostly. He earned—" She stopped. She had been about to say the figure, the modest salary that had defined the borders of their lives, and something warned her not to. Julian Crane was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Pity was part of it, but there was something careful in it too, something almost apologetic. "Mrs. Hartley," he said, "I'm going to tell you some things now, and I need you to know before I begin that all of them are true, and all of them are documented, and none of them are a mistake. I've checked. I checked 3 times before I sent that letter, because I anticipated you would find it difficult to believe." He opened a folder. "Your husband was our client for 19 years. In that time, we administered on his behalf a portfolio of holdings that, as of his death, we value, conservatively, at just over £14 million. The room went very quiet. Somewhere below, a phone was ringing. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said. "I think you've made, that isn't." £14,300,000, Julian Crane said, gently, relentlessly. "Held across property, equities, and a private company registered in Thomas's name. There is also the matter of the properties themselves, which are not counted in that figure, and the safe deposit box, which I have not opened, because his instructions were explicit that it was to be opened only in your presence." He paused. "There is a great deal I have to tell you, Mrs. Hartley. And I'm afraid some of it is going to be harder to hear than the number." Eleanor sat very still in her 9-year-old coat, in the expensive, quiet room, and understood that the man she had buried in the rain had been a stranger. The safe deposit box was not at the solicitor's. It was held at a private vault beneath a bank on Chancery Lane, the kind of place Eleanor had not known existed, a marble lobby, a lift that required a key, a corridor that smelled of cold metal and old paper. Julian Crane accompanied her, which she was grateful for, because her legs had not felt entirely her own since she left his office. "Thomas set this up in 2007, he said as they descended. "Before that, everything was more conventional. Then something changed. He restructured a great deal in a short period. He never told me why. Thomas rarely told anyone why." A woman in a gray uniform led them to a private room, brought the long steel box, and left them alone with it. Julian slid a key across the table. "His instructions," he said. "For your hand, not mine." Eleanor looked at the key for a long moment. Then she thought of the 12 people in the rain, and the fraying cuffs she had turned under so no one would see, and were careful people, Nell, and she picked it up and opened the box. Inside was less than she expected, and more than she could have imagined. There was money, bundled 50s, though not a fortune, a few £1,000s emergency cash. There was a British passport in Thomas's name that she had never seen, its pages soft with travel. Stamps from Zurich, from Nassau, from Singapore, cities Thomas had supposedly never been to. There was a second passport, and this one stopped her heart, because the photograph was Thomas's face, and the name beneath it was not. Edward Marsh. And beneath the passports, wrapped in oilcloth, was a bundle of letters tied with string, and a single photograph, and a sealed envelope with her own name written across it in her husband's careful hand. Eleanor, to be opened only by you. She did not open it there. She could not. She sat with the box's contents spread before her and felt the ground of 19 years tilt slowly beneath her, and Julian Crane, to his enormous credit, said nothing at all. He simply waited, the way a decent man waits beside grief he cannot touch. "Who is Edward Marsh?" she said finally. It was not quite a question. "I don't know," Julian said. "I want to be honest with you about the limits of what I know, Mrs. Hartley, because you are going to meet people in the coming weeks who will pretend to know things in order to take things from you. I administered your husband's legitimate holdings. Everything I handled was clean, lawful, and documented. I would stake my reputation on it, and I have. But Thomas kept rooms I was never shown. This," he nodded at the second passport, "is one of them." Eleanor picked up the photograph. It showed Thomas, much younger, perhaps 30, standing on the steps of a building she didn't recognize with 3 other men. 2 of them were laughing. Thomas was not. Thomas was looking at the man beside him, an older man, heavyset, expensively dressed, with an expression she had seen only once in 19 years. The night he came home gray-faced and would not say why, and held her too tightly, and told her that whatever happened he had only ever wanted to keep her safe. That had been in 2007. On the back of the photograph, in pencil, someone had written a single word. Ravenscroft. She read the letter that night, alone, at the kitchen table on Cobbler's Row, with Prue asleep upstairs and the rain finally stopped, and the house so quiet she could hear the clock in the hall. "My Nell," it began, and she had to stop and press the back of her hand to her mouth before she could go on. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've been to see Crane, and you're sitting there hating me a little, and you're right to. I lied to you every day for 19 years, not about loving you. That was the one true thing I never had to invent, but about everything else, where the money came from, who I was before you, why we lived the way we lived when we didn't have to. I made you a careful woman, Nell, and kept you poor on purpose, and I need you to understand it wasn't cruelty. It was the only way I knew to keep you invisible, because there are people who, if they'd known what I had and what I knew, would have come for it, and for you, and for Prue. Living small was the wall I built around the 3 of us. I'm sorry for the shoes we couldn't buy her. I used to sit in the car outside and cry about the shoes. Everything Crane has is yours, and it's clean, and you should take it and be happy and never think about the rest. But you won't. I know you. You've already found the second passport and the photograph, and you've read the name on the back, and that stubborn, brilliant mind of yours. The mind I spent 19 years watching you hide because the world told you a woman who left school at 15 had nothing worth hearing. That mind is already asking the question. So I'll answer it, and then I'll beg you to stop. Ravenscroft is a man named Gerald Ravenscroft. 20 years ago I worked for him. I found out something he'd done, something that killed people, Nell, ordinary people, to protect a number on a ledger. I kept the proof. It's the only reason I'm alive. He knows that if I die suspiciously it goes to the police, and if I disappear it goes to the papers. It kept us safe for 20 years. It's in a place only you would think to look. Remember the thing I said the day Prue was born, the promise, our promise. That's where it is. Take the money. Burn this letter. Let Ravenscroft grow old and die and never know your name. That's what I want for you. But if he ever comes near you or our girl, if the wall ever breaks, then you'll need to know that the meek little widow he'll see standing in front of him is the most dangerous person in the room. He'll underestimate you the way everyone always has. The way I let the world do to keep you safe. Let him. And then finish it. I love you, I'm sorry. I was always yours. Thomas. Eleanor sat for a long time. The clock ticked in the hall. Upstairs her daughter breathed in the dark, unaware that the shape of her whole life had just changed. And Eleanor Hartley, 44 years old, in a fraying cardigan, in a terraced house in Whitchurch, a woman a man like Gerald Ravenscroft would not have glanced at twice on the street, did not burn the letter. She read it once more. Then she folded it and put it in her pocket and went to find a pen and a clean sheet of paper, because the first thing she had learned in 19 years of managing on just enough was that you did not panic and you did not weep over what could not be changed. You made a list, you worked the problem. Remember the thing I said the day Prue was born, she wrote at the top of the page. The promise. Our promise. She knew exactly what he meant. And she understood, with a cold clarity that frightened her a little, that Thomas had been wrong about one thing. He'd thought he was giving her a choice. He wasn't. A man who had killed people to protect a number did not simply grow old and die. Men like that came looking, sooner or later, for loose ends. And a widow who suddenly inherited £14 million was the loosest end of all. The wall was already breaking. She could feel it. So she would not wait to be found. She would find him first. The man came on Thursday. Eleanor had spent Wednesday learning. This was the thing about her that Thomas had understood and the world never had. She did not need to be taught twice, and she did not need permission to begin. She had walked to the little library on Prince's Avenue, sat at the public computer with a notebook, and typed Gerald Ravenscroft into the search bar with the steadiness of a woman balancing a checkbook. What came back was a portrait of the kind of man who is never quite in the photograph. Ravenscroft Holdings, private, opaque, its interests spread across construction, care homes, and something called asset recovery that seemed to mean whatever was convenient. Gerald Ravenscroft himself appeared at charity dinners and nowhere else, silver and smiling, a philanthropist with a wing named after him at a Manchester hospital. There were no scandals. There was no dirt. There was only the particular cleanliness of a thing that has been very expensively scrubbed. She recognized the heavy-set man from the photograph at once, 20 years older, still not laughing. And on the third page of results, in an old regional news archive, she found the fire. 2007. A block of temporary housing in Salford, owned through a chain of companies that a diligent reporter had traced, eventually, to a Ravenscroft subsidiary. Faulty wiring flagged by inspectors and never repaired. 9 dead, 4 of them children. The inquest had returned misadventure. The company had paid a fine that would not have troubled Gerald Ravenscroft's lunch. The reporter who traced the ownership had, according to a single follow-up article, left journalism shortly afterward and moved abroad. 9 dead, 4 of them children. Something he'd done that killed people to protect a number on a ledger. Eleanor sat in the library for a long time, and then she wrote one word in her notebook and underlined it twice. Proof. Thomas had proof. Proof that the wiring was known, that the repair was refused, that the deaths were a choice made in a boardroom. That was the wall. That was what had kept a man like Ravenscroft from ever touching them. She was still turning it over when she walked home, which was why she noticed the car. It was parked across from the house on Cobbler's Row, a gray saloon, clean, the sort of anonymous that costs money to achieve. A man sat in it, not reading a paper, not looking at a phone, simply sitting, the way men sit when sitting is the job. He did not look at her as she passed. He didn't have to. She felt his attention move across her like a cold draft, and she made herself walk exactly as she had walked yesterday, the tired, unremarkable walk of a grieving woman with nothing worth watching. He'll underestimate you the way everyone always has. Let him. She let him. She fitted her key in the door with hands she willed to be steady, and she did not look back, and she thought, with a strange calm settling over the fear, so it's begun. He knocked 40 minutes later. He was younger up close than she'd expected, perhaps 35, with a good coat and a courteous, empty smile, and a card he offered her before she'd finished opening the door. Daniel Frost, Ravenscroft Holdings, client liaison. Mrs. Hartley, he said, I'm so sorry to intrude at such a difficult time. I wonder if I might have a few minutes. Eleanor kept the chain on. What's this about? Your late husband did some consulting work for our group some years ago. There are a few outstanding matters, documents mostly, that were in his care. Company property. We'd like to arrange their return, and of course we'd like to make sure you're properly compensated for your trouble. The smile did not move. Mr. Ravenscroft personally asked me to convey his condolences. He remembered Thomas fondly. The obscenity of it. 9 dead, 4 of them children, and here was his smiling young man on her doorstep, 4 days after the funeral, come to see whether the wall had died with the man who built it. Eleanor felt something crystallize inside her, cold and clear and quite unfamiliar. She had spent her whole life being smaller than she was. She understood, standing there with the chain on the door, that she was about to stop. But not yet, not today. I don't know anything about any documents, she said, and let her voice shake, which was not difficult, and let her eyes fill, which was not difficult either. Thomas kept his work to himself. I've got a mortgage I can't pay and a girl to raise, and I don't. I'm sorry, I can't help you. I don't know anything about his work, I never did. She watched Daniel Frost assess her. She watched him decide. She saw the exact moment he filed her away. A frightened widow, ignorant, harmless, no threat. And she felt Thomas's whole strategy of 19 years fold neatly around her like a coat she had finally learned to wear. Of course, Frost said, gentle now, almost kind. Forgive me. If anything of the company should turn up, old files, a laptop, anything of that sort, here's my card. There'd be a finder's fee, a generous one. He paused. It really would be best for everyone if these things were returned quietly, Mrs. Hartley. Loose paperwork has a way of causing trouble for people who never asked for it. The threat wrapped in silk. She let herself flinch at it because a harmless woman would flinch. I'll look, she whispered. If I find anything, I'll ring you. Thank you, he said, and went back to his clean gray car, and she watched through the net curtain as he made a phone call before he drove away, and she knew what he was saying. No threat. She doesn't know anything. She doesn't have it. Which meant she had bought herself a little time. Not much. Men like Ravenscroft did not leave loose ends because a widow cried on a doorstep. Frost would be back, or someone worse would, once they'd satisfied themselves the documents weren't sitting in a drawer. Which meant she had to reach the proof before they decided to stop being polite. Remember the thing I said the day Prue was born? The promise, our promise. Eleanor went upstairs, into the small back room that had been Thomas's, that she had not been able to enter since the funeral. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed where he'd slept the nights he came home too late to disturb her, and she made herself think, not about grief, not about the smiling young man, but about a single morning 16 years ago. The day Prue was born. A February morning, snow on the hospital car park, Thomas holding the tiny red creature who was their daughter and weeping in a way she had never seen before or since. And he had made her a promise, there in the ward, his voice cracking. I'll always keep something back for you too, whatever happens to me. There'll always be something I've kept safe, in the one place nobody would ever think to look because it's the most ordinary thing in the world. Our girl, our whole life, right in plain sight. She had thought at the time that he meant it as tenderness. A young father overwhelmed. She understood now that Thomas Hartley never said anything, not one word in 19 years, that did not have a second floor beneath it. The one place nobody would ever think to look, the most ordinary thing in the world, right in plain sight. Eleanor rose from the bed. She went to the corner of the room where Prue's old things had been boxed and stored years ago, the outgrown, the outdated, the things you keep because you cannot quite throw a childhood away. And there, on the top of the stack, was the thing that had sat in this house for 16 years, that a dozen searches of the property would have overlooked 100 times, Because who searches such a thing? Who even sees it? A child's toy. A worn brown bear with one eye, the first thing Thomas had bought his daughter, the bear that had sat on a shelf so long it had become invisible. Its back seam had been opened once, and sewn shut again, by a hand that was not a seamstress's hand. Eleanor held her husband's last secret in her two hands, and her heart pounded, and downstairs the house was quiet, and outside the gray car was gone but would come again. She reached for her sewing scissors. The seam gave way under the scissors with a small, obscene sound, 16 years of dust rising from the stuffing. Eleanor worked slowly, her fingers steady in a way the rest of her was not, easing the cotton wadding aside until she felt it, flat, hard, wrapped in plastic against the damp. Not papers. She had expected papers. This was a small metal object, cold and rectangular, and it took her a moment to understand what she was holding. A memory stick, and folded around it, a single sheet, and on the sheet in Thomas's hand, a list of dates and a name she did not know, M. Whitlock, and beneath the name, 3 words that made the whole thing turn over in her mind like a key finding its lock. She's still alive. Eleanor sat back on her heels. She's still alive. Not the proof itself, then, or not only. A person. Someone Thomas had kept track of, someone who mattered enough to guard for 16 years alongside the evidence. She thought of the reporter from the news archive, the one who traced the ownership of the burned building and then left journalism and moved abroad and vanished from the story. A follow-up article, she remembered. No byline I looked at closely. She had assumed a man. She had assumed wrong, the way everyone assumed, the way the world's whole machinery of assumption ran. M. Whitlock, the reporter, not fled abroad in fear, hidden by Thomas. Because a man like Ravenscroft cleaned up loose ends, and the journalist who had come closest to the truth was the loosest of all. Thomas hadn't only kept the proof, he'd kept the witness. He'd built 2 walls, not one, and told no one, and carried it for 16 years while he cried in the car about school shoes. Eleanor pressed the memory stick to her chest and breathed. She did not weep. There would be time for weeping later, years of it, and she knew even now that some part of her would spend the rest of her life grieving not the man she had lost, but the man she had never been allowed to meet, the one who had done all this quietly, alone, so that a woman in a fraying cardigan and a girl asleep upstairs could live an ordinary life on an ordinary street and never once feel afraid. She had feared she'd married a stranger. She understood now that she had married the bravest man she would ever know, and that his final act of love had been to make himself small enough to hide beside her. Let Ravenscroft grow old and die and never know your name, he'd written. That's what I want for you. No, Thomas, she said aloud to the empty room, to the one-eyed bear, to the memory of a man weeping over a newborn. You don't get to decide that. Not this time. You kept the wall up for 20 years so 9 families would have their proof one day. You don't get to have died wanting me to burn it. She would not burn it, but she was not a fool, and she was not a martyr, and she had a 16-year-old daughter who had already buried one parent. She would not walk into a police station tomorrow with a memory stick and a widow's word against a man who owned wings of hospitals and, quite possibly, people inside the buildings she'd need to trust. Thomas had understood that too. He hadn't gone to the police in 20 years. There was a reason. She needed to understand what was on the stick. She needed to find M. Whitlock before Ravenscroft's people wondered, as they eventually would, whether the widow had gone quiet because she was harmless or because she was hiding something. She needed allies she could trust and a way to make the truth land all at once, in daylight, somewhere it could not be scrubbed. The way she was already beginning to understand these things had to be done, though she could not yet have said how she knew. She was learning the shape of it as she went. That was the thing about Eleanor Hartley that not one person in her life, not the teachers who'd let her leave at 15, not the neighbors who pitied her, not the smiling young man from Ravenscroft Holdings, had ever thought to look for. The world had spent 44 years deciding what she was based on her coat and her postcode and the number of years she'd spent in a classroom. And Thomas, God help him, had spent 19 more building a wall around that same misjudgment and calling it love. They were all about to find out how wrong they'd been. She wrapped the memory stick in a clean handkerchief and put it not back in the bear. That was finished as a hiding place now, but into the lining of the 9-year-old black coat, behind the cuff she had turned under, in the place where she mended things so no one would see. Then she sewed the bear shut again and set it back on the shelf exactly as it had been, because if they came and searched, they should find a grieving woman's untouched house and a child's toy that no one would ever think to look at twice. Right in plain sight, the most ordinary thing in the world. She had learned from the best. Downstairs, the front door opened. Eleanor froze. It was gone 9. Prue was asleep. She had checked an hour ago. She had locked the door. She had locked it. Footsteps in the hall, slow, unhurried, the footsteps of someone who did not expect to be interrupted. Eleanor stood in the dark of Thomas's little back room with her husband's coat in her hands and her heart hammering against her ribs, and she heard a man's voice, low and pleasant, call up the stairs. "Mrs. Hartley," said Daniel Frost, "I do apologize for the hour. I'm afraid we're past the part where I ask nicely." And then, from the top of the stairs, in a small frightened voice that stopped Eleanor's heart entirely, "Mum, Prue."